went to work for McDermott in April of 1968 as a MTO draftsman person, $1.60 an hour. And by that time I was married. Then I started to watch how things went along, and I started every 2 or 3 years getting a promotion. And by, I guess, 1975, when Cognac came around, I was promoted to the project engineer for Shell's Cognac platform.
Had you been working on platforms?
I was a field engineer, what they called a field engineer, and I was doing, back then, the structures. We were building a lot of shallow, what we would call shallow water today. Yeah. But I was handling all various clients for the jacket fabrication. McDermott was set up with separate yards for jacket fabrication, for topside fabrication, for rolling pipe. And so I had several clients that I was responsible for: Shell, Exxon. I was humbled when I first started in Exxon, and several other clients. And if you remember at some of that time in the early 70s, when there was a heavy drilling program, people were buying slots, and we were getting slots from like Mobil for 11 platforms at a time. So, you know, you could, you know, as a field engineer, I could be ordering steel, and that was mainly the job of a field engineer back then, was to make sure that the field had everything they need to build the work. It wasn't complicated work. If you fed the yard the material in the right sequence, the jobs got built. The craftsman level was very high. So when Cognac came around, they appointed me the project engineer from McDermott's side to handle the fabrication of the jacket. And that was an interesting thing. So I ordered all the steel for the structure, and then took on the responsibility of helping the superintendents build the job. And it was a step function change. If you go back and look at the water depth record before Cognac was, I think, 373 feet, and Cognac jumps up to 1,020 feet. Mm-hmm. And we didn't have, if you look at the offshore industry as it was then versus now, the biggest derrick barge was 500 tons. So there was a whole lot of stuff had to be done. The jacket had to be built in 3 pieces. The base section had to be built vertical. The mid section on its side, the top section on its side, and the interfaces, you had 3 interfaces or 2 interfaces to match. We had to learn how to measure what to us was large distances relatively accurate. Yeah, yeah. And I can tell you a little anecdote on when we started building the base section. The first leg, I can remember the dimension, it was 172 foot 6 inches. And it's just a straight piece of pipe, 72-inch diameter. And if I didn't measure that leg 150 times, I didn't measure it once. And we couldn't duplicate measurements. And I bought everything you could think of to make accurate measurements and try to repeat them. And make a long story short, we finally figured out that temperature corrections, we knew about temperature correction, but it's not about ambient temperature, it's about steel temperature. And we figured out a way to measure the average steel temperature to give us a way to measure and duplicate the measurements. And once we did that, it worked out pretty good. And in fact, Shell hired Boeing at the time. Boeing was the kind of premier dimensional control specialist in the country, and they hired those guys, and at the end of the day, they verified that what we were doing was working. So because Dan Godfrey and I, Dan mostly developed the tables to convert, you know, take the coefficient of expansion of steel and graph it with temperature and thickness and length, and it worked out pretty good. And we ended up, it fit. A lot of unique engineering on that project. The piling, the first time we used underwater pile drivers, but they didn't. And the piling would float it out. They carried them. They floated them out in one piece. I remember I had to float them out in one piece. We had to tow them, and they wanted them to tow in a certain way. So I had to find a place that would fill up 24-inch diameter pipe with lead to make the keels. That was a unique thing. Buying lead. It was was interesting.
The pile drivers weren't used much after that, right? Or were they?
Those type of hammers, yeah, they were.
Oh, they were, okay.
They were used, yeah. I mean, they still use underwater hammers today for all the deep water stuff. So
Okay.
a lot of it was really a testing bed for further down the road, I guess. They didn't particularly trust the rigging department, so they posted guards on the barge the night we were getting ready to load out the base. They had guards on the barge. I was in the yard watching what was going on, and we were putting the jacks in the cassettes. These were 200-ton jacks horizontally, so they could push. And so the rigging, after they were, Dan Godfrey was my counterpart. He went to dinner off-site. So when we were putting the last jacks in, the rigging superintendent came find me. He says, Myron, I think we moved the jacket. I says, no, you didn't do that. He said, yeah, come see. So I walked up to the base section, and the Teflon was yellow, right, covered with grease. So I walked up to the base section, I looked down, and there's about that much clean Teflon. And what had happened is, when they were putting the jacks in, as they put a jack in, they tightened up on it so it would hold in place. And they kept adding, and every time they added load, well, we actually moved the jacket in with just the back jacks, with less than, we think it was less than 800 tons of push. And so when we were looking at I was looking at this clean Teflon, and I got about 30 riggers around me in the yard, and this rigging superintendent, and somebody says, here comes Dan Godfrey. And boy, all of a sudden I'm standing by myself. And Dan walks up to me, and he looks at me and he says, I guess you can't trust anybody. I had to write a letter to explain what had happened, and it was interesting. It was funny. It's funny now. Because Dan had knew by the time he got back to the yard, the guards on the barge had heard what, and they had radioed to him.
Did that cause any concern? Was there a big cause for concern? Or?
No, they were just mad because they didn't get the number. We didn't have any. They wanted to measure, because they were going to read the jack pressures off the barge when we started pulling, and calculate the breakaway coefficient of friction. It wasn't big. It was, that Teflon works. Well, I started getting phone calls in the spring of '85, of 1985. Somewhere around April. In fact, you know Mr. Bailey? He's one of the pioneers. He started calling me because he was dealing with Kiewit, because he had the ETPM. I can go into that detail, but anyway, he was tied in with Kiewit some kind of way, and he started calling me and asking me if I wanted to go to, run Bullwinkle and Kiewit's offshore group. I'd keep telling them, well, thank you for calling, and I'll think about it. And they kept calling, and by the time it was September when I made up my mind and decided to move to Texas and build Bullwinkle. In fact, I called Gordon Sterling one day. I said, Gordon, I'm getting these calls. I said, who's these Kiewit guys?
Yeah. Tell me what you learned.
Yeah, who are they? And then I said, well, where do you want me to be? That's what I asked Gordon. I said, where do you want me to be? And he basically just told me, he said, well, Kiewit are good people. And I said, okay. And then, like I said, McDermott at that time, I thought, and I don't want to talk about, but there were things different. It was different. It was changing. And so I accepted the offer and ended up moving to Texas in September of 1985.
And that's where all the created down in that.
Well, that's the beginning. Well, see, Kiewit's thought was that the deep water was coming. And Bullwinkle is really not deep water anymore. Huh?
But you needed big yards.
You needed deep water access, and that was where the forethought was. The Bullwinkle yard, where we built Bullwinkle, you see, at the beginning of Kiewit went into business as Gulf Marine Fabricators. And then they had a joint venture called Bullwinkle Constructors. Okay, Bullwinkle Constructors' yard was on the Corpus Christi ship channel and intercoastal waterway. Gulf Marine Fabricators' yard was 3 miles up the intercoastal. Okay. It wasn't on deep water. The intercoastal is only 12.5 foot deep down there. So, and they had them set up as two separate entities. Gulf Marine Fabricators was an entity, and Bullwinkle Constructions was a joint venture, initially with Kaiser.
Okay.
If you remember Kaiser from the West Coast.
Kaiser Steel, yeah.
They're no longer existent, and we actually bought them out of the joint venture quite early because they went financially, they couldn't handle their financial end of the deal. So we bought them out of the joint venture, so it ended up being 100% Kiewit deal, Bullwinkle. And then in the first year of Bullwinkle, we ended up merging Gulf Marine and Bullwinkle together as one. And that's when I took over the whole operation.
Okay.
We started Bullwinkle in '85 and finished it in '88. And that's, to this day, that's the easiest project I've ever run, was Bullwinkle. It was well set up. Well, we had good people. I recruited about 10 people from South Louisiana that were really critical to the success of Bullwinkle. A guy named Myron Rodrigue, and a guy named Snow Westerman, and several other people, Tony Gagliano, all people.
But were they all from McDermott originally?
Pretty much. That's,
yeah.
that's the people I knew. But they were the top of the line, and they all. I mean, it wasn't easy to recruit them, but they all understood where the future was. I think.
But to get the Louisianans out of the.
Oh, it's hard to move Cajuns. I didn't want to move. In fact, the last conversation I had with the Kiewit people and Mr. Bailey, wasn't the last, but when I came home one day and I told my wife, I said, I don't think they're going to call back. They did. So, but no, Bullwinkle was a very successful project, very well done. But there was some, the deep water didn't really hit right away.
And that was really on the edge of the shelf, yeah.
Yeah, but it finally came around, and Kiewit's very successful in the offshore construction business now.